Mark thought it would be just another quiet afternoon as he walked into the boutique with his fiancée, Emily. He had no idea that a single shopping trip would turn his entire life upside down. The moment he refused to pay the shocking $8,600 bill, Emily's expression shifted from annoyed to unhinged in a split second. She suddenly screamed, slapped herself across the face, and collapsed to the floor crying that he had attacked her. Customers froze, employees panicked, and all eyes turned to Mark as Emily continued her performance. But in the chaos, he managed to lift his phone and start recording, capturing every second of her staged meltdown. Minutes later, security reviewed the footage, and the truth shattered Emily's lie on the spot. Handcuffs clicked around her wrists, and Mark stood there stunned, unaware that this was only the beginning of a nightmare far darker than anything he could imagine. Mark had always believed that the worst moment of his life was the scene inside the boutique, but he soon learned he was wrong. When Emily was escorted out in handcuffs, he felt a mix of heartbreak and relief, thinking the situation would fade once the truth was exposed. But the very next morning, everything spiraled into something far uglier than he ever imagined. Emily was released on bail, and within hours, she began flooding his phone with messages, apologies, accusations, threats, and desperate pleas all mixed together. One minute she claimed she didn't remember what happened, the next she swore he had somehow provoked her, and then she'd shift into begging him to take her back because she couldn't survive without him. Mark blocked her, but new numbers kept appearing, each one more frantic than the last. His stomach twisted every time the screen lit up. By the end of the day, Emily escalated her claims, posting publicly online that Mark had been abusing her for over a year, using old photos of unrelated bruises and scratches that she framed as evidence. She was relentless, tagging his friends, coworkers, and even distant relatives. Mark's phone buzzed nonstop, with confused messages from people who didn't know what to believe. Some defended him. Some questioned him. But the worst part was knowing that Emily was only getting started. That night, Mark heard banging on his apartment door. When he looked through the peephole, he froze. Emily stood there with tears streaming down her face, begging to be let in. He didn't answer. He didn't move. He simply recorded her through the door as she screamed, threatened, and finally crumpled into sobs on the hallway floor. Security eventually forced her to leave, but Mark barely slept afterward, shaken by how quickly things had escalated. The next morning, he went to the police station and filed a full report, turning in every message, every call log, and the video from the night before. The officers took it seriously, assuring him that the evidence protected him, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And he was right. Emily's mother, Karen, soon arrived at his apartment building, screaming accusations loud enough for the entire street to hear. She pounded on his door and yelled that Emily had been hospitalized with emotional trauma because of him. When Mark refused to engage, she tried to force the door open and actually swung her purse at him when he cracked it open only to ask her to leave. He closed the door immediately, heart pounding, and called the police again. Another report. Another piece of the puzzle added to the growing stack of evidence he never wanted to have. By the end of the week, Mark finally accepted that his life was no longer his own. Emily's lies had triggered something far darker within her, and she wasn't going to stop, not until she either got him back or destroyed him completely. And for the first time, Mark realized that the boutique meltdown wasn't the climax of the story at all. It was only the first crack in a nightmare that was just beginning. Karen showed up at Mark's workplace 3 days after the incident, and that was when he realized Emily's behavior wasn't a personal spiral. It was a family operation. She marched straight into the lobby, demanding to see him while shouting accusations loud enough that several clients turned to stare. Before security intervened, she slammed a stack of papers on the front desk and claimed he owed Emily $90,000 for emotional damages, medical bills, and destroyed future prospects. Mark felt his chest tighten as he watched her wave the papers around like evidence, her voice trembling with fury rather than grief. Emily's desperation mutated into something sharper, colder, and far more dangerous than emotional chaos. It started when Mark noticed several unauthorized charges on his credit card, tiny amounts at first, the kind meant to test whether the card was active. Then came a $500 purchase from an online boutique he'd never heard of. He froze the account immediately, and the bank confirmed the login attempt came from an IP address just a few blocks away from Emily's apartment. Mark stared at the email from the bank, realizing she wasn't just harassing him anymore. She was trying to financially bleed him. The courtroom felt colder than Mark expected, a silent reminder that this was no longer a personal nightmare, but a legal battlefield he had been dragged into. He took his seat quietly, his hands clasped tightly together as he waited for Emily's entrance. When the doors opened, a wave of murmurs swept across the room. Emily appeared in a flowing white dress, her arm wrapped in a thick brace, and her body supported by a wheelchair pushed by an attendant who looked as confused as everyone else. Her face was pale, trembling, and her expression crafted perfectly for sympathy. Mark stared in disbelief. He had seen her sprinting down the hallway of his apartment building just a week before. Mark believed the courtroom verdict would finally force Emily to stop, but within weeks he realized she had no intention of letting the truth or the law restrain her. Her behavior grew quieter, colder, and far more calculated, as though she had shifted from emotional chaos to strategic destruction. It began with strange noises outside his apartment late at night, footsteps that stopped when he stepped near the window, the faint sound of gravel crunching, and shadows that lingered just a moment too long before disappearing into the darkness. He kept recording everything, but there was never a clear face. The final court hearing arrived with an atmosphere heavier than any Mark had experienced before. This time, the courtroom wasn't filled with curious strangers, but with officers, investigators, and legal staff who already knew the long, twisted history leading up to this moment. Mark sat quietly at the back, his hands clasped together, watching as the doors opened and Emily was escorted inside wearing a county jail jumpsuit instead of the carefully crafted costumes she once used to manipulate sympathy. There were no props, no wheelchair, no dramatic cast, no trembling performance. Just Emily, pale and angry, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal searching for an escape route. Mark returned to his everyday life slowly, as though each step required him to relearn what peace felt like. He no longer checked over his shoulder when walking to his car, and he no longer woke in the middle of the night expecting another crisis manufactured by Emily. Instead, small moments of normalcy began to rebuild him. He spent quiet mornings drinking coffee, without dread lingering in the back of his mind. He reconnected with friends he had pushed away during the chaos, allowing himself to laugh again without feeling guilty. Though the legal battle had ended, the echoes of everything he endured still followed him, appearing in flashes of memory or sudden unease. But each time those shadows surfaced, he reminded himself that he had made it through. The truth had prevailed, the threats had stopped, and the people who had hurt him were no longer able to reach into his life. He started journaling, writing down what he hoped his future might look like, and for the first time in a long while, the pages felt open instead of suffocating. He allowed himself to imagine new possibilities, new relationships, and new routines untouched by fear. As weeks turned to months, he realized he wasn't just recovering. He was finally reclaiming the life that had been stolen from him.